Welcome to some very famous people you've never really heard of. Bite-sized biographies of the famous, the infamous, and the quirky in less than an hour. My name is Philip D. Gibbons, and there is more information about me, this podcast, and a bibliography at someveryfamouspeople.com. There are also photographs of many of the individuals and items mentioned in this podcast. At the conclusion of Part 1 of this presentation, there will be additional suggestions concerning further information about today's subject, Theodore Roosevelt, 26th President of the United States. Now let's get started with our story about Theodore Roosevelt. On September 6, 1901, President William McKinley was scheduled to meet and greet the public in Buffalo, New York, at the Pan American Exposition, a World's Fair that began in May 1901. McKinley was decisively re-elected in November of 1900 and was in the midst of a committed effort to unveil his economic plans for his second term. After public perception that he rescued the country from economic ruin after the disastrous panic of 1893 and increased America's foreign policy stature as a result of the triumphant Spanish-American War, McKinley enjoyed immense popularity. Following a speech at the exposition on September 5th, the following day, McKinley and his wife traveled to Niagara Falls. Ida McKinley was still recovering from serious illness and canceled any afternoon appearances. At approximately 3:30 p.m., the president made his way to the Temple of Music, a large temporary exposition auditorium selected for the purpose of McKinley's public reception. Heavily organized with major security, McKinley's appearance was largely symbolic, his interaction with the public scheduled for only 10 minutes, nowhere near enough time to greet all of the crowd lined up to meet him. Even this minimal exposure was opposed by some of the president's advisors, who attempted to cancel the event due to safety concerns. The president adamantly refused, based on his widespread popularity. He felt he had nothing to fear. As soon as the president arrived and was situated, doors to the building were opened at 4 p.m., and McKinley, an enthusiastic campaigner who loved connecting with constituents, quickly began to greet the rapidly moving procession, as an organist first played the Star-Spangled Banner and then continued with a selection by Bach. Known for his ability to shake 50 hands per minute, McKinley only paused once to remove his good luck red carnation, fulfilling the request of a 12-year-old girl who asked for it as a souvenir. At 4:07, an individual named Leon Czolgosz approached the president. Czolgosz was a sporadically employed factory worker who circulated among various socialist and anarchist political groups in the Midwest. A resident of Ohio, he had recently traveled to Buffalo with the knowledge of McKinley's impending appearance. Only days earlier, based on nebulous anarchist ideas and his own personal irrelevance, he came to the conclusion that he should assassinate McKinley and purchased a .22 caliber pistol for this purpose. After several failed attempts to stalk the president at the exposition, he made a point of arriving at the Temple of Music early and was fortunate enough to be among the group that would actually meet with McKinley. Czolgosz had also taken the deliberate precaution to wrap his hand in a modified handkerchief that seemed to indicate some sort of injury. Underneath this supposed bandage, the assassin gripped his revolver. Normally, the Secret Service would prevent anyone from approaching the president who did not display clearly empty palms. But based on the extreme heat, numerous fairgoers were handling handkerchiefs to wipe away perspiration. Agents relaxed this embargo based on this circumstance and also were presumably duped by Czolgosz's ruse. Even President McKinley himself was fooled by Czolgosz's wrapped, seemingly injured right hand. Instead of reaching for it, he attempted to shake the anarchist's left hand. Stepping forward, Leon Czolgosz pulled the trigger twice, the first bullet deflecting harmlessly, possibly off of a metal coat button, but the second entered the president's abdominal region, and he staggered backwards. Only the support of his aides kept him from falling. Pandemonium ensued, bystanders, security, and Secret Service pummeling Czolgosz to the ground, preventing an attempted third shot. As he was led away, still conscious, President McKinley observed the throng continuing to punch and kick the assassin, and could only softly say, "Be easy with him, boys." McKinley was quickly taken to the hospital on the Exposition grounds. Unfortunately, this facility was poorly equipped and certainly lacked the ability to treat an abdominal gunshot wound. Only relatively inexperienced surgeons were available, and these individuals attempted to extract the bullet lodged somewhere in the central portion of McKinley's body. Hampered by the president's obesity, the bullet could not be located, despite extensive manual probing. Both the incision and wound were cleaned and stitched, and the president's condition seemed reasonably stable. The next day he was fully conscious, interacted with his wife and others, all reassured that he would pull through. Confident of the president's recovery, Vice President Theodore Roosevelt embarked on a remote Adirondack vacation with his family. But McKinley's seeming recovery was only transitory. Eventually, his wound became gangrenous, a typical result of improperly treated gunshot wounds. By September 11th, he was experiencing severe abdominal pain resulting from infection. On September 13th, his heart began to fail as a result of rampant sepsis, his condition now clearly terminal. President William McKinley died on September 14th, 1901, at 2:15 a.m. Somewhat obscure today, at the time, McKinley's death, especially by an assassin's bullet from such a politically reprehensible individual, shocked and depressed the nation. But the process of presidential succession was a clearly stated exercise. Theodore Roosevelt was located in the Adirondacks and told of the gravity of McKinley's condition. Before boarding a train for Buffalo, he received a telegram informing him of the president's death. He was, for now unofficially, the President of the United States. Roosevelt's ascension was the result of a series of coincidences and intrigues that initially were meant to render him politically powerless and remove him from his position as the governor of New York. Only months before the 1900 Republican convention that renominated McKinley, sitting Vice President Garrett Hobart died from heart disease, leaving the vice president's office vacant. At the National Convention, New York State Republican Party bosses angled to have Roosevelt put on the ticket. They had helped get Roosevelt elected, but were hoping to rid themselves of an independent executive who was politically combative and frequently advanced progressive ideas that they considered problematic. What better place to stash this annoyance than the vice presidency, also neutering Roosevelt's chance of a 1900 New York State re-election. The powerful Ohio political boss and McKinley mentor, Senator Mark Hanna, was adamantly opposed to such a move, stating presciently at the time that there was only one motivated assassin standing between Roosevelt and the presidency, this in an era where several European monarchs, as well as 2 American presidents, were relatively recent assassination victims. Hanna was outnumbered by other Republican Party activists who believed that Roosevelt's maverick progressive outlook would be of no consequence, as nothing would happen to the immensely popular McKinley, and Roosevelt was placed on the ticket. Now, Theodore Roosevelt, at 3 p.m., in the library of the home of a Buffalo associate, was poised amidst a group of McKinley's cabinet ministers and government officials to take the oath of office. After a brief statement reaffirming his support of President McKinley's policies, he was sworn in at age 42, still today the youngest president in U.S. history. At the time, Mark Hanna remained unimpressed, stating privately, "Now look, that damned cowboy is the President of the United States." For Roosevelt, becoming the U.S. president was only the latest in a series of unforeseen and remarkable events which had marked his life even from early childhood. Theodore Roosevelt was born in New York City on October 27, 1858. His father, Theodore Roosevelt Sr., was a wealthy businessman and a member of the prominent entrepreneurial Roosevelt family. His father, Cornelius Roosevelt, a merchant, financier, and multimillionaire. Although born into relative comfort, Theodore Jr. suffered from severe bronchial asthma and was a sickly child. Although his father remained a strong child and influence, his mother, Martha, a Southerner, was also prone to bad health and frequently unable to cope with raising a family of 4 children. T.D., as he was nicknamed, the second oldest and first son, was homeschooled with the rest of his siblings, initially by an aunt and then more formally by tutors hired by his father. The 4 Roosevelt children did lead a rather sheltered life, the family eventually residing at 6 West 57th Street, one of the most fashionable addresses in Manhattan, only steps from Fifth Avenue. They played among themselves in a specially designed private courtyard and had access to an interior gymnasium installed by Theodore Sr. to encourage physical activity. All of the Roosevelt children afflicted with various long-term maladies. As he grew into his teenage years, T.D. focused on fitness, determined to strengthen his previously scrawny physical appearance, lifting weights and hitting a body bag, boxing lessons also a part of this newfound regimen. By age 14, after a growth spurt, he filled out and was much healthier, radiating a newly developed confidence. T.D. was also the most studious of the Roosevelt children and became fascinated at a very early age by science, especially as it related to birds and animals. Probably aided by his family's affluence, he developed a precocious interest in ornithology, actually acquiring and preserving samples of birds that he kept in his bedroom, which became practically an exhibit space. He was also an avid reader of serious texts concerning natural science, history, and contemporary literature. His parents were determined to expose their children to international travel, believing it to be an enlightening experience, their eldest son carefully chronicling these journeys in detailed diaries, especially sites involving archaeology or history. These endeavors were merely a preamble for several years spent preparing for the first step of an eventual career path, education at Harvard College. Entrance to this prestigious institution required passing a set of entrance exams, a task Roosevelt, greatly aided by tutors, provided for this specific endeavor, accomplished easily. Now a very confident 18-year-old and a shining star within his own family, Roosevelt set out for undergraduate life at Harvard. Circulating amongst the most socially prominent members of his class, Roosevelt was known as Ted, not Teddy, a nickname he did not like or ever use. He initially concentrated on a science curriculum, but eventually moved away from a course of study that required laboratory work and did not emphasize natural science. Nevertheless, he was an excellent student, officially in the top 10th of his class, after his second year of study and socially active. But in one of the great traumas of his early life, in February 1878, Roosevelt received word that his father was gravely ill. Immediately setting out for New York by train, Ted was unable to arrive at his father's bedside in time. Theodore Roosevelt Sr. died on February 9, 1878, at the age of 46, his unexpected death leaving his eldest son in a state of shock and profound grief. He became even more serious about academics, dedicating himself to his father's memory. He eventually graduated 21st in a class of 177, was Phi Beta Kappa, a member of the prestigious Porcellian Club, Hasty Pudding, and participated in various athletics, most notably boxing. He also met and aggressively courted and even proposed to a Boston socialite, Alice Lee, who turned him down, mostly because of her young age. Typically, he continued to pursue Alice, wearing her down until she finally agreed to a formal engagement. To many, he seemed rather eccentric. Even after his engagement, he became upset when any males interacted with his fiancée, threatening such malefactors with a duel. Luckily, such drama was avoided, and on October 27, 1880, only months after his graduation and his birthday, Theodore Roosevelt and Alice Lee were married in Brookline, Massachusetts. He then enrolled at Columbia Law School with every intent of emulating an uncle, Robert, a prestigious member of a Manhattan law firm. But Ted quickly became disenchanted with this discipline. In a portent of his developing social attitudes, he came to believe that the law ignored the public interest and was merely used as a weapon to protect the wealthy and powerful. By the end of his second year, he decided to leave Columbia. Fortunately, a substantial inheritance allowed him the freedom to decide what profession he would rather pursue. His father was formerly active in New York Republican Party politics, mostly as a result of his wealth and social status, but party insiders were wary of Roosevelt Sr.'s penchant for maverick beliefs and his demands for governmental reform. Ted Jr., not surprisingly, espoused similar attitudes about what he believed to be institutional corruption, and made these quite plain as a member of New York's Republican Club. Feeling that this aristocrat, who frequently attended meetings in formal attire, would be the perfect candidate for the famous Silk Stocking Assembly District made up of Roosevelt's own wealthy social set, they nominated the neophyte who pledged to run and conduct himself as a reform candidate, ready to help rid the legislature of corruption and to physically clean up literally the garbage and other filth collecting in the streets of New York City. A tenacious campaigner, in 1882, Roosevelt easily won his first election to the New York State Assembly, the body's youngest member, aged 23. He would be in the forefront of the endless battle between the reformers and advocates of the status quo. In his speeches and interactions with other assembly members, he adopted a practically evangelical attitude towards fighting what he considered to be special interests, unethical government, and corruption. A Republican, he was hampered by the 1882 gubernatorial election of Grover Cleveland, a Democrat, but did cooperate with Cleveland, also elected as a reformer, to pass a bill addressing the rampant and corrupt spoils system of government employment. Although the Assembly minority leader in 1883, Roosevelt failed to be voted Speaker when Republicans won majorities back in 1884. While highly visible, again, Roosevelt's reputation as a loose cannon alienated some of his fellow Republican lawmakers. In the midst of another demanding legislative session, the lawmaker received word that his pregnant wife and mother were both gravely ill. He quickly returned from Albany to New York City to his mother's home, where his wife was also preparing for his first child's birth. Although this child, a daughter, was born and survived, his wife Alice died 2 days later on February 14, 1884. Doubly tragic, on the same day, in the same house, his mother also died of typhoid fever, only 48 years of age. Initially, Roosevelt seemed to respond to his grief by attempting to completely turn the page on his marriage, his sister assuming responsibility for raising his infant daughter, also named Alice, after her deceased mother. He sold his New York City home and rapidly finished building a spacious residence at Oyster Bay, Long Island, New York, a calm sanctuary from both the chaos of Manhattan Island and tumult of Albany. He called this residence Sagamore Hill. Roosevelt did return to the state legislature, but the major political event of the year was the Republican National Convention, again typically a battle between a reform element and entrenched politicians and party bosses. Although Roosevelt was part of the inter-party negotiation and squabbling, he eventually adopted a hands-off position and pledged to support whoever the convention decided to nominate, ultimately Senator James G. Blaine. Blaine was not only an establishment figure, he had been tarnished by several personal financial scandals and was anything but a reformer. His opponent was Grover Cleveland, and Roosevelt's support of Blaine was tepid at best, the young assemblyman also still not in the best of spirits after the tragic events of February. In a close and contentious campaign involving all sorts of allegations of immoral and unethical behavior, Cleveland eked out a victory. By then, Roosevelt was spending a great deal of time in the Badlands of the Dakotas, his interest in the area sparked by a buffalo hunting expedition in 1883. Perhaps in an additional attempt to deal with his grief, he bought several ranch properties, intent on raising livestock and remaining in this remote area. A widower, he spent much of his time exploring the vast open territories and came to appreciate both the abundant wildlife and remarkable natural beauty of the Great Plains. Initially perceived as an upper-crust tenderfoot from New York City and practically a joke, despite his store-bought buckskins and eyeglasses, he eventually ingratiated himself with the cowboys and ranch hands he worked with. He spent 2 years in the Dakotas, even writing and publishing a book about his experiences. He was lured back to the East Coast by his 1886 nomination as the Republican candidate for mayor of the city of New York. Although he gave his typical enthusiastic and vociferous effort, drawing large crowds to speeches all over the city, he finished third, conservative voters coalescing in favor of a centrist Democrat against a radical socialist third candidate, to Roosevelt's detriment. One positive from Roosevelt's return to New York life was a renewal of his relationship with a woman he had known since early childhood, Edith Caro. Literally a next-door neighbor when Roosevelt was a child, the two maintained a very close relationship until Ted's Harvard years, when suddenly the two seemed to have a falling out of some kind. After the death of his first wife, Roosevelt shut off any social contact with women, believing it to be disrespectful to the memory of Alice. However, upon a chance meeting of Edith at the home of his sister, the couple once again became romantically involved. However, influenced by Victorian mores, they kept the relationship a secret. After their engagement, they separated, and Edith moved with her mother to London, and Roosevelt returned to the Dakotas to figure out what to do with his various ranch and cattle holdings, which were a losing proposition. He then journeyed to London, where he and Edith were married on December 2nd, 1886. After a lengthy honeymoon, the couple returned to Sagamore Hill, Edith insisting that Roosevelt's first child be included within their family. Although his personal assets were somewhat depleted by his Western forays and healthy expenses, Roosevelt had the economic ability to embark on a writing career, quickly producing biographies of Thomas Hart Benton and Gouverneur Morris and The Winning of the West, a very popular 2-volume account of American expansion across the western frontier. By 1891, he had published 8 books, a successful and profitable writer. At the same time, Roosevelt also remained active in politics. He supported Republican Benjamin Harrison in the successful presidential campaign of 1888. He was then appointed a commissioner on the United States Civil Service Commission, typically a patronage job that Roosevelt attacked with his usual zeal. With federal jobs, especially in the post office and federal customs houses, typically doled out as political rewards for campaign workers, frequently to incompetent or unqualified individuals. Roosevelt redesigned the examination process for such jobs and instituted an expansion of a merit system to as many positions as possible. His tenure was so impressive that despite ruffling some feathers of entrenched Washington, miffed at his attempt to minimize the traditional political spoils system, upon the election of Democrat Grover Cleveland in 1892, Roosevelt was reappointed. His position required a move to the capital. Despite occupying a modest residence, Roosevelt was also quite active in the social whirl of D.C. His closest friend was probably Senator Henry Cabot Lodge from Massachusetts. John Hay, staff member of Abraham Lincoln and eventual Secretary of State, was also a frequent dinner guest in Roosevelt's home, as well as many other senators and prestigious office holders. By 1895, Roosevelt also had achieved a prominent political profile, respected enough to be offered a position on the board of the New York City Police Commission, which elected him its president. The newly elected and reform-minded mayor was interested in leadership that would eradicate the corruption and malfeasance that ran rampant through New York's police department, and considered Roosevelt the perfect man for the job. Too energetic to sit behind a desk, Roosevelt tirelessly walked the city, frequently accompanied by a journalist, the commissioner intent on finding a cop sleeping on the job, or cooping, as it was known, drinking in a tavern while on duty, or even frequenting a brothel. His frequent exposure of such malefactors, sensationally written up by a reporter, gained him celebrity and approval from especially the lower middle class, tired of a corrupted system which seemed implacable. By day, he also traversed every corner of the city, also with journalists like Jacob Riis. Such exposure heightened Roosevelt's awareness of the gap between the moneyed classes he came from and the desperate existences of many of his fellow citizens. As well as misbehavior, corruption was also built into the infrastructure of the police department itself. Employment as a police officer was essentially for sale, individuals giving cash to political bosses in exchange for a job as a police officer, the price depending on location and stature. Cops earned this money back by taking payoffs and even shaking down businesses, merchants accepting the situation as an unfortunate cost of doing business. Roosevelt helped implement an examination system that reduced the ability for party hacks to sell off NYPD employment. Although he was able to impede the blatant corruption that preceded his tenure and built the foundation of a civil service environment, Roosevelt was unable to eradicate the mentality that pervaded the police department well into the 20th century. His determination and inflexibility when it came to ethics and perspective also made him a controversial government official. Although the thousands of New York saloons who served especially the lower classes of the city were legally supposed to close on Sunday, tavern keepers, usually via bribing the local beat cop, routinely stayed open illegally. Roosevelt demanded that the police aggressively enforce the law, forcing many previously open bars to obey this prohibition. In a world where most workers had only one day off a week, Sunday, the police commissioner suddenly became a very unpopular person. Politics frequently driven by ethnicity suddenly became unified with an upcoming 1897 mayoral election. Germans, typically Republican voters, vociferously threatened to join their fellow Irish citizens, who generally were Democrats, in ousting the Republican administration. After only 15 months on the job and recognizing that an incoming Democratic administration would be sure to either limit his power or expel him from office entirely, Theodore Roosevelt called on some of his D.C. connections to extricate him from this politically precarious situation. After assurances that Roosevelt would leave his reform-minded attitudes behind, the newly elected McKinley administration found the besieged police commissioner a position as the Undersecretary of the Navy. For Roosevelt, this appointment was no placeholding sinecure. He had definite opinions about the potential United States ascendance as an international power, and he understood that such a process would require a significant upgrade of American naval power. When his boss, Secretary John Davis Long, took an extended summer vacation in 1897, Roosevelt officially took his place with decision-making authority. While he implemented only modest changes involving promotions and spent time interacting with Congress, his most important process was interacting with like-minded individuals on implementing a major increase in American military infrastructure. This perspective was partially driven by a specific situation in the Caribbean region where Spain still maintained control of various colonial outposts, including Cuba. Such a presence was considered a barrier to American influence in the region, and many political officials felt that a future confrontation with Spain was inevitable. With this in mind, Roosevelt formally asked Congress for resources that could provide a dozen new battleships and cruisers, a veritable fleet of torpedo-carrying patrol boats, as well as a modernization of naval installations nationwide. But the current administration and McKinley himself were not initially interested in such an expansion, the president intent on maintaining a more isolationist approach, wary of American involvement in an armed conflict. However, in response to increasing antagonism amidst Cubans fighting for their independence and troops defending the Spanish Empire, the American government ordered the armored cruiser USS Maine to sail to Havana, ostensibly to safeguard both American interests and American citizens. Arriving on January 25, 1898, the ship remained anchored in Havana Harbor until the night of February 15th, when inexplicably, at 9:40 p.m., an explosion rocked the ship's gunpowder magazine, detonating tons of explosives, the front part of the ship completely destroyed as a result. Severely damaged, the rest of the Maine slowly sank. 266 men were killed or died shortly after the incident. 94 individuals survived the blast, but American reaction, especially from tabloid publications owned by either William Randolph Hearst or Joseph Pulitzer, was hysterical outrage, fueling not only the public's anger, but deliberately distorting and exaggerating news to increase tension, if only to massively improve newspaper circulation. Although many factions within the government already agitated over stories of Spanish atrocities against insurgents in Cuba and the Philippines were eager to intervene, the Maine incident did not immediately prompt a formal American declaration of war. President McKinley chose instead to privately seek diplomatic and peaceful resolution to the volatile situation. The country was just emerging from a severe recession, and business interests were unsure of how an armed foreign conflict would affect this recovery. Gradually, the confluence of public outrage and political resolve wore down the anti-war element within the U.S. government, especially when the tabloid press irresponsibly began to print unsubstantiated allegations that a Spanish mine or explosive device was the only possible explanation for the destruction of the Maine. Reluctantly, President McKinley in early April requested that Congress authorize the use of troops in Cuba to intervene in the colony's civil war. A sequence of ultimatums and a naval blockade of Cuba by the U.S. all but ensured that Spain would declare war on the United States, this declaration occurring on April 23, 1898. The U.S. responded with its own declaration 2 days later. Roosevelt did not wish to sit idly by as a spectator to a war he enthusiastically supported. After a final order to Admiral Dewey to proceed to the Spanish colony of the Philippines in anticipation of a conflict there, he resigned his cabinet post and requested a commission in the Army's Expeditionary Force intent on the invasion of Cuba, as well as permission to form a volunteer regiment. He had zero naval experience, but had spent 3 years as a captain in the National Guard, so such an assignment was not implausible. Because the U.S. Standing Army was undermanned, an emphasis was placed on recruiting volunteers for the war effort. The unit that Roosevelt helped organize and made famous was officially designated as the 1st Volunteer Cavalry Regiment, commanded by Colonel Leonard Wood. then the personal physician of the president, but also a Medal of Honor winning veteran of the Apache War of 1886. Roosevelt, designated as a lieutenant colonel, was second in command and helped sort through over 20,000 requests to join this fighting force, eventually nicknamed the Rough Riders based on their jaunty, unusual uniforms. Although the unit did have a few college athletes, polo players, and high society types from the Northeast, most of the contingent came from the American Southwest, commanders believing that Cuba had a similar hot climate and that these men were already skillful on horseback. Roosevelt used his influence with the military to ensure that each man would receive a distinctive uniform, a carbine and a Colt revolver, as well as other appropriate cavalry equipment. Roosevelt's own uniform was custom-made by Brooks Brothers, flamboyant, with flashy folded cavalry hat, a bright yellow stripe adorning his khaki pants, and safari jacket. Although, on May 29, 1898, 1,060 men and approximately 1,250 mules and horses were assembled in Tampa, Florida, to await transport to Cuba, poor logistics prevented some of these soldiers and the great majority of livestock from departing the mainland. 2/3 of the regiment were actually deployed and landed on June 23rd without incident near the southeastern port city of Santiago de Cuba. Linking up with other U.S. troops already present, reconnaissance within the nearby jungle spotted the Spanish outpost at Las Guasimas. Several units were immediately ordered to attack this position, and a 2-hour-long battle dislodged the Spanish, who retreated towards Santiago. The Rough Riders suffered casualties of 8 dead and 39 wounded, and in the aftermath of the battle, illness from yellow fever and malaria also began to wreak havoc on the invaders, including several members of the High Command. This prompted the promotion of Colonel Wood to leader of an Army cavalry brigade and promotion of Roosevelt to colonel and head of the 1st Volunteer Rough Riders. Orders were then given to the entire American contingent to begin the 8-mile march in the direction of Santiago. This route was defended by Spaniards manning fortifications and trenches on the San Juan Heights. Arriving at the base of this steep impediment, Roosevelt was frustrated by the lack of specific orders. Several of his men were wounded or killed by snipers firing from the Spanish positions, the Americans vulnerable and unable to find adequate cover. Eventually, Roosevelt and the Rough Riders were ordered to attack one of the 2 hills that made up the heights, Kettle Hill. Gradually, assisted by a battery of 3 Gatling machine guns, Roosevelt, one of the few Americans on horseback, led the charge of the Rough Riders, waving his hat over his head and at times well in front of his men. Despite heavy resistance, it took only 20 minutes for the Rough Riders and a variety of other units to gain control of the position. The other position on San Juan Hill was also eventually subdued, a Spanish counterattack mowed down by the newly situated Gatling guns, accompanied by several Colt Browning machine guns. U.S. military focus on Santiago was not a casual objective. A flotilla of Spanish battlecruisers and destroyers was anchored there, bottled up by a blockade of American warships. Eventually, capture of Santiago would force these ships to engage with the U.S. Navy. On July 3rd, the Spanish fleet, sensing that an American capture of Santiago by U.S. infantry was imminent, attempted to make a run for it. All 6 ships were either destroyed or captured in a mere 2 hours, the Spanish no match for superior American tactics and armament. Combined with the destruction of Spain's Pacific Fleet at Manila Bay on May 1st, the Spanish-American conflict was effectively over. The only issue left, negotiation over the fate of Spanish colonies. Subsequently, the Philippines, Guam, and Puerto Rico became American possessions. Although the U.S. publicly maintained that Cuba would be granted sovereignty as an independent nation, American troops remained on the island. Upon their future withdrawal, the U.S. retained the right to deploy military force to intervene if necessary, and a naval base on Cuban soil at Guantanamo Bay, completely controlled by the U.S. Navy, was established, essentially in perpetuity, the base's continuity maintained by a lease agreement that required a nominal payment from the U.S. to the Cuban government. The Spanish-American War established the U.S. as a formidable imperial power. Because of extensive newspaper coverage, Theodore Roosevelt emerged as a national hero, although he was eventually denied a Medal of Honor because of anger from politicians in Washington, who were embarrassed when Roosevelt and other officers signed an official letter describing the dire situation concerning illness which was prevalent throughout the U.S. troops in Cuba. Roosevelt inferred that the U.S. government was indifferent in removing soldiers who had either contracted or were susceptible to typhoid, yellow fever, or malaria. 1,600 men died from typhoid, 4 times the number of combat deaths, frequently resulting from filthy conditions in U.S. installations and encampments. Despite Roosevelt's proactive attempts to persuade various politicians and government contacts to intervene, he would not receive a Medal of Honor until January of 2001, awarded to his descendants by President Bill Clinton. Nevertheless, Roosevelt's popularity had immediate political consequences upon his return to the U.S. Only weeks after arriving from Cuba, he was nominated by the New York State Republican Party as its gubernatorial candidate. The incumbent, Frank Black, was deemed to be vulnerable after several political scandals, and it was felt that Roosevelt would provide the best opportunity to retain control of state government. Theodore Roosevelt did not disappoint with his campaign in the fall of 1898. He barnstormed throughout the state of New York, usually traveling by railroad to speak publicly at just about any city or town of magnitude. His speech is brief, but described as so charismatic and motivational that crowds literally chased him down the track as his cavalcade departed. Headed to the next location, the people cheering and waving hats and handkerchiefs as they ran after the receding candidate. The candidate's reception and the excitement generated by his campaign received national attention. A Western newspaper editorialized about Roosevelt, "He is a rare combination of originality, unconventionality, candor, self-confidence, alertness, fearlessness, aggressiveness, positiveness, and nervous energy, and it is no doubt this combination which has made him the popular hero he is today." The bedrock of Roosevelt's campaign was a populist appeal for ethical and honest government, with an emphasis on economic opportunity for all, recognizing that big business and high finance typically ignored and even victimized the working class. However, the election was close, Roosevelt eking out a victory by a little less than 20,000 votes out of 1.3 million cast. An example of his boundless energy, Governor-elect Roosevelt wrote an account of his service in Cuba with the Rough Riders, first serialized in Scribner's magazine and then published as a book, an effort that was both very successful and only added to his political capital. At the time of his inauguration, New York was the most populous state in America, with a huge industrial base, as well as a large rural agricultural entity. New York City, the financial capital of the country, and several other cities like Buffalo and Rochester, industrial centers as well. But the state legislature had not kept up with adequately governing and managing these various industries and assets. The governor himself, a veritably powerless individual, constrained by the legislature that was easily dominated by a half-dozen political bosses on both sides of the aisle, who were mostly interested in doling out patronage and receiving bribes from the various industries they allowed to prosper with minimal constraint and no taxation. Although a Republican, Roosevelt espoused a political agenda that was surprisingly aggressive, forcing corporations to desist from monopolistic and unfair practices, instituting taxes on corporations that controlled the various utilities that provided gas, water, electricity, and public transport, franchises frequently purchased through bribery and without any taxation. Like the New York City Police Department, Roosevelt sought to end political patronage by instituting a formal civil service system, and also was among the first public figures to raise issues concerning the environment, industrial pollution, and preservation of wildlife habitat. Needless to say, the status quo, including members of Roosevelt's own party, strenuously resisted such change. Thomas Platt, one of two New York U.S. senators and the most powerful individual in New York Republican politics, had only reluctantly supported Roosevelt's gubernatorial candidacy, fully understanding the candidate's iconoclastic ways, but figuring any Republican was better than losing the office entirely. Platt was a traditional Republican, responsive to the needs of trusts and corporations, hostile to any populist ideas, and operator of a massive patronage operation that was directly threatened by Roosevelt's idealistic approach to government employment. Although he was not completely successful, the force of Roosevelt's personality allowed him to pass hundreds of bills, usually crafted after compromises were reached with the various power brokers and interest groups. These bills attacked the cronyism that infested repairs on the Erie Canal, an estimated 10% of money spent siphoned off by unethical contractors, established a state preserve in the Catskill Mountains, ended political appointments to leadership positions in state governments, instituted an 8-hour workday for government workers, and so on. The governor putting into legislative practice his progressive ideas in a manner that was politically achievable and realistic. Most importantly, for the first time, Roosevelt was able to impose taxes on the entities that owned utilities, much to the dismay of financiers like J.P. Morgan. Roosevelt's success only increased his national profile, he himself believing that he could mount a viable national campaign for the presidency in 1904. President McKinley perceived as well on his way to re-election to a second term. But Roosevelt's success also alienated boss Thomas Platt to the extent that he was determined to remove what he considered to be a seriously destructive entity that might permanently cripple the Republican New York political machine. In late 1899, he began a secret process that would seemingly elevate Roosevelt to the then vacant vice presidency on the McKinley ticket, but actually merely install him in a powerless position far away from the political machinations in Albany, New York's state capital. At the time, another Republican power broker and McKinley political mentor, Ohio Senator Mark Hanna, objected, "Don't any of you realize there is only one life between this madman and the White House?" But Platt won out, and even Roosevelt, initially opposed to such a nomination, eventually agreed, figuring it might be an even better springboard to a 1904 presidential campaign, something he was considering anyway. At the time, traditionally sitting presidents did not campaign, many voters considering such solicitations as undignified. William McKinley's famous front porch campaign of 1896 was in direct contrast to his opponent, William Jennings Bryan's extensive use of railroad travel, which he used to give over 600 speeches across the country. By contrast, McKinley symbolically greeted voters from the porch of his Ohio home, meeting over 700,000 visitors at his Canton residence. These events painstakingly choreographed by his campaign manager, Mark Hanna, to ensure that any participants were hand-picked supporters of the Republican candidate. McKinley's strategy paid off with a resounding electoral defeat of the populist Bryan. Almost all of the urban northeastern states supported the governor of Ohio. The election of 1900 was a rematch in which Roosevelt was turned loose, a much more enthusiastic public speaker and campaigner who branded Bryan a dangerous economic radical who would upset the McKinley administration's successful return of the country to prosperity. With America now an international power as a result of the Spanish-American War, the election of 1900 was a McKinley landslide. Inaugurated in March of 1901, Roosevelt then did little other than presiding over the Senate during presidential appointments. After that, he literally had no official responsibility. The Senate adjourned until November of 1901. His own belief that his office was virtually ceremonial, now a personal reality. This stagnation was shattered by the urgent September 6, 1901 bulletin that William McKinley had been shot by an anarchist at the Pan American Exposition in Buffalo, New York. Initially, the president's wounds were not believed to be fatal, but poor medical treatment resulted in an internal infection that became gangrenous, and on September 14, 1901, McKinley passed away. Theodore Roosevelt was sworn into the presidency on the same day, to this day at 42 years of age, the youngest man ever to hold the office. After the interruption of a family vacation in the Adirondacks, a whirlwind of travel by horse-drawn carriage, railroad, and a makeshift inauguration wearing borrowed clothing, an exhausted Roosevelt slept soundly. Waking up on September 15th as the president, he pronounced himself as feeling bully, a then often used adjective that meant marvelous or superb, and a word that became synonymous with the 26th president of the United States and his administration. Thank you for listening to part 1 of this podcast about Theodore Roosevelt. Information for this podcast came from the books The Theodore Roosevelt Biographical Trilogy by Edmund Morris, When Trumpets Call, Theodore Roosevelt After the White House by Patricia O'Toole, and Theodore Roosevelt and the Assassin by Gerard Helfrich. There are also additional photographs, bibliographical, and musical information at someveryfamouspeople.com. If you have enjoyed this presentation, please like us at our Facebook page, Some Very Famous People, and follow us on Twitter at Philip D. Gibbons. Subscribe to my YouTube page at Noblesse Oblige, and please note that all of Bite-Sized biographies are now available on YouTube and YouTube Music. And please tell a friend about Bite-Sized biographies.